For most of us, if we think about why China appears to have become so dominant in batteries technology, it's tempting to reach for all the reasons that many of our Western analysts and companies and politicians tend to feed us, namely that it's all been driven by unfair government subsidies, horrible cheap labour, and lower environmental standards, leading to an uneven playing field. And depending on who you listen to, that explanation is usually followed by one of two conclusions. It's either we in the West need to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to recreate what's already been achieved in China so that we can bring all that manufacturing back to our shores, or the race is already over, China's already beaten us, we're all doomed, end of story. The thing is though, some people have taken the trouble to actually travel to China to get a better idea of what's going on there. And I mean not just popping across to Shanghai or Beijing and meeting with high-level representatives, but really seeking out the industrial heartlands and talking to the people in the factories and the distribution centres and the recycling facilities to see how it genuinely all works in practice. And when you talk to those people, you start to realise that the rather starkly contrasting conclusions that I just outlined might both be missing some fairly important details that we overlook at our peril. Articles like this one, written by battery industry analyst Eric Melin, paint a very different picture of the variables at play in China's industrial success, and the lessons for the rest of the world might not be quite what we expect. So I thought we should have a bit of a think about that. Hello, and welcome to Just Have a Think. The city that caught Eric Melin's attention is called Yichang. Now, unless you're an expert on Chinese geography, there's a pretty good chance that name doesn't mean very much to you at all. Certainly didn't to me, I must confess. It's definitely not one of the big shiny cities like Beijing, Shanghai or Shenzhen, that's for sure. But it is home to almost 4 million people, and it sits in Hubei province close to the enormous Three Gorges hydropower infrastructure on the Yangtze River. According to Melin, what makes Yichang so interesting isn't just the fact that it's got some battery factories, although it has, it's that it represents an entire industrial ecosystem. It is fair to say that it's very fortunately placed geographically, not just because of all that cheap energy from hydropower, but also because the region has vast resources of phosphate, a material that's suddenly become a must-have as battery manufacturers scramble to move away from politically and socially toxic materials like cobalt and nickel. So Yichang has lots of companies producing materials for the lithium iron phosphate batteries that are rapidly superseding the lithium nickel cobalt manganese or NMC batteries that power many existing electric vehicles. It has cathode production, it's got cell production, it's got companies building energy storage systems, it even has shipyards working on electrification of maritime transport. In other words, it's not just a bunch of battery factories, it's like an entire battery economy. Now, of course, there has historically been some truth in the allegations of cheap labour and subsidies and government support that I mentioned at the start of the video. China absolutely has a powerful industrial policy framework, and labour costs are generally lower than Western Europe or the States. But Melin argues that explanation comes nowhere close to understanding the more nuanced dynamics at work. He says China sometimes behaves less like a centrally controlled industrial machine that we often imagine, and more like an enormous startup.
I think the entrepreneurship comes there as well, that you have a lot of entrepreneurship, you have a lot of, for anyone that would like to catch those opportunities, you can do so, right? Also, as the industry is often so integrated, they are producing so much. They are producing not only the batteries, they are also producing the excavators that made that plant. It's an extreme, especially if we compare with Europe, it's an extreme pool of talent because they have been working on this for a long time. So you have a lot of skilled people. You have a lot of skilled people from the universities. You have a work ethics that is very, very strong, which I don't think we have in the same way in Europe. But I think ultimately is that they have been active in the battery field for so long now. So that means that for every year you're compounding expertise, you're compounding or you're building on what you already have. If we are just waiting and planning, you don't make those experiences.
When new industries emerge, companies can start small and experiment and make mistakes and improve, and then scale incredibly quickly. In battery recycling, for example, Melin describes seeing operations that might begin with very manual processes, but then you go back a year later and they're semi-automated. Go back another year later and they're fully automated. The point is, manufacturing expertise isn't just created out of thin air on day one of a new factory operation. It accumulates over time. Every mistake teaches you something. Every production problem solved becomes institutional knowledge. Every generation of engineers trains the next generation. And China's been going through that process with batteries for decades. Meanwhile, much of Europe and North America spent years debating whether electric vehicles were even going to happen at all. And as Hans-Erik said, while you're waiting and planning and discussing, you're not learning. That doesn't mean Europe and America can't build factories. Of course they can. But it does mean the challenge is much bigger than just pouring concrete and installing equipment and announcing a gigafactory, which is often the impression we get from pronouncements made by the European Commission or startups in the US. Which sort of brings us to another misconception: competition. One of the common assumptions in the West is that Chinese companies operate almost like different divisions of one giant organisation, all moving together under government instruction. But Melin argues the reality is very different.
In Europe and also in the US, our narrative is always that the Chinese companies, they work in some kind of, almost like an army against us. But it's really companies that if they're working against anyone, it's actually working against their competitors. They have to fight.
In other words, companies like CATL and BYD and dozens of others are not just fighting international competitors, they're fighting each other. And that domestic pressure is part of what drives efficiency and cost reductions. Now, none of this means China's system is perfect, of course. I don't think any rational commentator is suggesting that. Every political and economic system comes with trade-offs, doesn't it? But one difference Melin highlighted is the relationship between government direction and industrial response.
In Europe and also in the US, when you have new policy, when you have new legislation, the reaction from companies is usually, okay, how can we push back? While in China, when there is new policy, basically the companies they read that policy and say, okay, this is what we have to do to accomplish. This is how we go forward. And yes, of course, if that would be a ridiculous policy, that would obviously not be a great way of governing neither a country or a company. But if it is, if it does make sense, then it's also a way for you to have long-term planning, and which they obviously are known for.
History is full of examples of governments confidently heading off in completely the wrong direction. But in the case of electrification and batteries and renewable energy, China appears to have made a strategic bet that has paid off. And that leads to the $64,000 question, doesn't it? Namely, can Europe and America catch up? The answer to which appears to be maybe. But according to Melin, we first have to be honest about what we're actually trying to catch up with. Over recent years, we've seen major efforts like the European Battery Alliance and the US Inflation Reduction Act designed to create domestic battery supply chains. And there are very good reasons for doing that. Supply chain security matters, industrial capability matters, and most importantly of all, jobs matter. But Melin argues that the debate sometimes focuses too narrowly on building out a whole bunch of factories to comfort ourselves that we've finally reinvented the halcyon days of our industrial past, while perhaps forgetting that the reason we need batteries in the first place is not so that we can build lots of shiny new battery factories, it's so that we can accelerate electrification, reduce fossil fuel dependence, and create cheaper, cleaner, more resilient energy systems. In that context, what if the biggest opportunity is not battery manufacturing industry, but a battery economy? So what does that mean then? Well, let's remind ourselves of what batteries are and what they're not. They're not an energy source in their own right, are they? They're just a medium for moving energy through time and space. In other words, they allow cheap midday solar power to be used in the evening, and they allow vehicles to replace imported oil with locally produced electricity. They also allow grids to become more flexible. They allow energy waste to be minimised. Last year, for example, the UK spent well over £1 billion paying wind turbine operators to switch off their turbines even when it was really windy, because we just didn't have the grid infrastructure to get those electrons from where they were being generated to where they were needed. There are actually various ways to overcome that problem, but massive amounts of battery energy storage is definitely one of them. So perhaps the real value to an economy is not the infrastructure for building batteries, but the actual energy infrastructure those batteries facilitate, regardless of where they're built and sourced from. Maybe the real value is created after the battery has left the factory.
I mean, if you look at a company like Apple, 50% of the profits in Apple comes from services or from sales of apps. So they can use it. They can create value based on that, and it doesn't matter where the things are produced.
In other words, maybe the challenge for Europe and arguably the United States as well isn't necessarily how do we manufacture billions of batteries in competition with a country that's already pretty bloody good at doing that. Maybe it should be how to create maximum value from those billions of batteries once they exist. That's definitely an infrastructure opportunity, which just in itself represents probably at least a generation's worth of well-paid skilled jobs. Right now, those of us in the Western world seem unable to make our minds up about whether we're in a state of blind panic about China or whether we're still being dangerously complacent while lobbing out hackneyed rhetoric about cheap labour and subsidies. Analysts like Melin and others argue that that explanation is just not good enough to provide the whole picture of why China has got to the dominant position in the battery sector that it enjoys today. Equally though, the idea that we've permanently lost is probably a bit wide of the mark as well. You only need to look back at the way Japanese automotive manufacturers were at first shunned and then embraced by Western nations in the 70s and 80s to find a template for working in harmony with market disruptors for everyone's benefit. Trying to clash with them head to head is a mug's game, and it really shouldn't be our game. The world's going to need an almost unimaginable quantity of batteries over the next few decades, not just in electric vehicles, but also on our electricity grids and in our homes and factories, and even in other sectors like shipping. And there will no doubt be opportunities throughout that entire system, but at least according to Hans-Eric Melin, only if countries understand where those opportunities can genuinely add value, rather than trying to recreate a supply chain for the distributed energy future based on outdated principles of fossil fuel-based hegemony. No doubt you've got your own views on this one, so if you're now champing at the bit to express those views, then as always, the place to leave them is in the comment section below. That's it for this week though. A big shout out to the fantastic channel supporters over on Patreon who enabled me to keep ads and sponsorship messages out of all my videos. You can join them and have a look at all the extra stuff you can get involved with there by visiting patreon.com/justeverthink. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and most importantly of all, thanks very much for watching. Have a great week, and remember to just have a think. See you next week.